Welcome to Front Runner Motorsport.
Hello there, this is Front Runner Motorsport, and I'm doing a video that I don't really like that much. I don't like reaction videos. I'm not going to play the video I'm reacting to and then stop it every now and again to make a point. But I do want to talk about ALDAS's Why Lewis Hamilton is Great video that he released I think about a week ago. Because about a month ago I released a Lewis Hamilton is overrated video, which is basically the exact opposite views. And I just want to discuss why people take those views. Lewis Hamilton is probably the most derisive champion in Formula 1 history, where some people are claiming he is the god of Formula 1, no one else ever compares to him, and others are he's a pretty boy who keeps winning and it's really boring. And no, there's a middle ground to each argument. So, before I start, ALDAS did say that it's fine if you don't agree with him, which is good because that's what I'm basically doing. And it doesn't really matter in the long run. He has loads of subscribers. I have 11. Thank you, by the way. So, he's not going to care what I think anyway. And neither is Lewis Hamilton for that matter. You know, Lewis Hamilton's a multi-millionaire, successful personality. He has other things concerning him than what someone with 11 subscribers thinks on YouTube. So, this is just a video to illustrate some points, or my points of view. Nothing more. That said, if you disagree with me or agree with me, leave a comment. I'd like to read them. I've had some interesting ones in the past. So, as I said, I'll start with ALDAS. He did say it's fine if you don't agree with him. I'll say the same. It's absolutely fine if you don't agree with me. I think greatest of all time is a problematic phrase in anything because there's so many varying factors. So, we'll be looking at the points ALDAS brings up and I'll be presenting my counter-argument. Starting with ALDAS at the start of the video says Lewis Hamilton has been amazing in all fashions this year. And I actually saw a BBC article, might have been before Hamilton actually was declared champion, that said this has been his best season ever. And I honestly think this has been Lewis Hamilton's most average season, because he's had the success, obviously, he's champion, but you haven't seen those moments from Hamilton where he just takes it up a notch and no one can compare. He has at times. There's that lap at Silverstone when he had used tyres on and he did the fastest lap on the last lap. But there hasn't been as many, is what I'd say. And he's won the championship more because he hasn't really been challenged. I mean, you see other manufacturers, Ferrari being the main one, obviously, who can't go a race without messing up their strategy, and they're just not on the pace of Mercedes anyway. So, this is definitely Lewis Hamilton's most average season for a long time, maybe since 2012, 13. He's still been very good. He's still champion. The next point was Bottas is the biggest challenge. This is the only point I would say is laughable, because Bottas, as I've always said, and it's not a very fair opinion, but Bottas is not very good. He was average at best, always. He is a very, very competent point scorer. That's why Mercedes hired him, because they knew with Rosberg and Hamilton, they were not in a good place. Like, if that had continued, they'd be crashing out every week, getting into arguments. It's not good for the media side of, and the sponsors and that, for Mercedes to have two drivers fighting all the time. Bottas was hired because he's the perfect second driver, in that you can claim he is not the second driver. It's not in Lewis Hamilton's contract that he has to have the other driver be the second driver, but Bottas just can't be a title contender. It's kind of like Felipe Massa in the sort of late 2000s, where he's not the second driver, but he is, just by his talent levels. Bottas will score points, Bottas will get podiums, he'll take wins every now and again. He can be quick on his day, but throughout a whole season he cannot keep that up. He makes far too many mistakes, he crashes a lot. He just doesn't seem to have that ability to turn up to 11 and really take the fight to Hamilton. And I think, you know, it's an overblown thing that Bottas is even close to challenging Hamilton. He's really not. He finished second this year, and that's because Mercedes is really good. But if you replaced him with Verstappen or Vettel or Leclerc, even Albon or Sainz or Ricciardo, it would be closer, because they're drivers who can just turn it up when they need to. The next thing ALDAS used to prove his point was the numbers, and this is what all Hamilton fans do. They say, look at the numbers. The amazing amount of wins, the record number of pole positions, the fastest laps, the fact he's now a 6-time championship, only one behind Schumacher. Numbers don't mean anything in this sport, because, and it's a point I'll get to later about Mercedes' dominance and how it's been far too easy for Hamilton. You know, you can't compare these numbers. He compares them to Fangio. Fangio raced in an era when there were 10 races a year, and one of those was the Indy 500, which no one competed in, other than the Americans who usually competed in the Indy 500. There was no drivers going over from Europe to compete in that. So the championship as a whole is completely different and completely uncomparable. And even then, the 2 years Mercedes were dominant, they dominated. But you cannot take the likes of Jim Clark, Jackie Stewart, Alberto Ascari, and even Fangio and say Lewis Hamilton, based on stats, is better. Because if Jim Clark had 21 races a year, had survived beyond his premature death, he could have kept going, he might have racked up those numbers as well. But he didn't have the opportunity to. And Jim Clark instead spent the year racing in loads of different formats. He was a British touring car champion. He won the Tasman 500. He did compete in the Indy 500. He was a driver who could turn his hand to anything and win. So are you saying Jim Clark's not as good as Hamilton? Not comparable. You can't... Like, Lewis Hamilton wasn't alive when Jim Clark died by a long way. So stats do not prove anything. Compare him to Senna when the eras are closer. There were more races in 1980 than there was in 1960. But still, the racing is so very different. And the field in that time was so much more competitive. 1989, 1990, you had Prost, Piquet, Senna, Mansell, all top-class legendary drivers who you could make arguments to be the greatest of all time for. Nowadays, you know, you got Hamilton, Vettel, although I would question his motivation. Verstappen's not the finished product yet. Bottas is weak sauce. Albon, you know, I hope Albon gets there, but he is driving where Red Bull realistically are. That's how good Verstappen is. He is really outperforming his car. So I do disagree with the more championships than Fangio argument. You go back and watch, I have watched some 1950s stuff. It's actually harder to find because obviously it wasn't filmed in the same way, so there aren't complete races of just Fangio going around lap after lap. It just couldn't film it that way in the 50s. But what you can see is there's a race, I think it's at the Nürburgring, possibly Hockenheim or Spa, where Fangio has to pit because of issues with his car, probably commonplace in the 50s. And he loses like 2 laps to the Ferraris. And he just goes out and hits fastest lap after fastest lap and gets those 2 laps back and overtakes the Ferraris and wins. That's masterful. At the same time, Silverstone, probably 1955, or Aintree, it was Aintree, not Silverstone. Moss versus Fangio. That fight is amazing. By modern standards, that is an incredible fight. And masterful driving, and you can't compare that to what we have now, because it's all completely different. 100%, there's not one similarity. Bringing up Schumacher. I mean, I would argue that Schumacher was dominant for 5 years, 2000, 2004, in his Ferrari, where Barrichello was the number 2 driver. He couldn't overtake Schumacher, and there weren't many people on Ferrari's level in those years, which is, you know, surprising. If you've never watched that era of Formula 1, then you're thinking Ferrari dominant. It's hilarious. But when he was dominant, you know, the racing was just as boring, really. You just knew Schumacher was going to win. And you had the likes of Montoya and Ralf Schumacher, very good drivers, but they were not competition. Raikkonen in his very early days was really good. But like no one could compare to Schumacher. But he only really had that dominance for 5 years. The rest of his career, you know, you're talking about Ferrari's worst ever era, where they just did not win. You know, they wasted the talents of the likes of Alesi and Berger. Even Prost and Mansell raced for Ferrari unsuccessfully. So when Schumacher joined Ferrari from Benetton, he was leaving a World Championship winning car and going into the unknown with Ferrari, because you didn't know they were going to come back. When they did it in style and they dominated for 5 years. Arguably the first two of those he had to deal with Häkkinen. Häkkinen is a great driver. One that is never really mentioned in the pantheon of great drivers, but Häkkinen was really great. It's a shame when you think of like great world champions, most people don't really think of Mika Häkkinen. But, you know, when he won 1999, not a great year for the sport. I mean, I think Eddie Irvine was his most, you know, competent competitor that year. Schumacher was injured halfway through the season. Schumacher had challenges. I would argue Lewis Hamilton has never been challenged for a world title. Because, you know, he won it in 2008. He beat Felipe Massa. You know, he, again, by definition, was that Ferrari second driver without being the actual second driver. Raikkonen, who had won it in 2007, did not give a shit in 2008 and 2009. He was looking to go to rallying. He was just finishing out his contract. I love Raikkonen, but he did not care. He was completely done with Formula 1 at that point. And he came back and it was better, but it was not the same Raikkonen. And Lewis Hamilton's teammate was Heikki Kovalainen, who is another really bad driver. He was average at Renault, and McLaren were like, yeah, we'll get him. It was not a good time. So when we go into the Mercedes era, you can talk about Rosberg. Rosberg put up a fight, and is he as good as Hamilton? He beat him. It's hard to tell, really. He only beat him in 1 year. Hamilton beat him twice. 2-1 Hamilton. But I think on his day, Hamilton was generally quicker than Rosberg. Bottas doesn't compare. He's not even as good as Rosberg was. So Hamilton just has not been challenged when he's won the world title. Qualifying, he mentions qualifying. Yes, Lewis Hamilton is a great qualifier. He just smashes those laps. You can say what you like about Mercedes party mode. The driver still needs to put the car in the perfect place on the track to get that perfect lap time. One of the best, up there with Senna. Senna was always a great qualifier. So I don't really have anything against that. Yeah, he is great over one lap. I will give you that one. I think Rosberg was a more consistent driver over 50 laps, which might be controversial. But Rosberg over a race distance, he could handle himself. Hamilton can as well, but I think Rosberg is also very underrated as a driver. Very, very capable. And I've said in the past he didn't compare to Hamilton. That might not be true. You never really saw the best of Rosberg. I think those 2 years where he lost to Hamilton and he had the things like he was throwing the cap at him after a race showed the worst side of him. He was a very capable driver. Sundays, though, another point he makes that Hamilton's one of the best on Sundays. He is sometimes. That being said, we'll come back to Mercedes dominance, which is a big thing in this. Hamilton's a very good race driver. He's a chronic moaner. Like when he's way up in the lead, or he has a strategy on his side and he's like whinging on the radio about, oh, my tyres are going off, and then just finishes the race on those tyres anyway. I think that's a problem with modern Formula 1. I think a lot of drivers do that nowadays. There are other drivers who are also good on a Sunday more than a Saturday. I don't think he's one of the best drivers on a Sunday. He's fine. Everyone has their days. Hamilton probably has more good days and bad days. But But I'll come back to Mercedes dominance again. He is still very good. He mentions beating Alonso in 2007. Hamilton's rookie year was amazing because he was a rookie driver coming out of nowhere, and he outperformed a two-time world champion in Alonso, who had only just won those 2 titles. That is unbelievable. He was incredible, and he got into Alonso's head. And Alonso probably would have won that championship if he hadn't let Hamilton get in his head. If he just carried on concentrating on his own races, Alonso would have been world champion in 2007, and if he'd kept a good relationship with McLaren, probably in 2008 as well. He didn't though. And by Hungary you could tell that Alonso was kind of, fed up and on his way out. And he killed his own career by going back to Renault, who were a middle of the road team by then. So I don't think we ever saw Hamilton and Alonso in a fair fight, because Hamilton was a rookie for a start. He shouldn't have been competing with Alonso. It's amazing that he did. But we never saw the best of Alonso that year. This wasn't the Alonso from a year previously. He was so desperate to be champion again. But at the same time, he let it into his head and it just ruined his season. And, we could have had Alonso being a 4 or 5-time world champion. And maybe Mercedes would have gone with him and he'd be breaking records. But instead, Alonso committed career suicide. Hamilton had a great rookie year. Say what you're on about 2008, which I think was a messy year. It was a very entertaining year to watch. But Hamilton made mistakes, Massa made mistakes. Hamilton really won it by luck. 2008 was a fluke. And you can say that Hamilton had his engine failure in Hungary. Massa could have been world champion. But Massa also had the thing in Singapore with the fuel rig where he pulled it off into the track with him. Obviously that race was won by Alonso, funnily enough. Hamilton and Massa made mistakes, but Massa should never be competing for a world title, and Hamilton only just beat him. ALDAS mentions that Hamilton is a very good wet driver. That is true. He is extraordinarily good in the wet. I've heard things before about British drivers always being good in the wet because they grow up in it, because it rains all the time. That is probably true. If you're a Spanish driver and you compete in your early days nationally in Spain, it rains very rarely, so you don't have that experience. But you do go to Europe, Europe, Formula V8 3.5 or GP3, GP2. They take place in the wet sometimes. I guess British drivers just get exposed to it more and maybe you do get better. I would mention other great wet race drivers. Button, another British driver obviously. He was incredible in the wet. In Canada 2012. Everything that happened in that race and Button still won it. And obviously Senna, Donington 1993. Probably the best drive in Formula 1 history. If you haven't watched the highlights for that race, they're on YouTube somewhere. Go watch them because that race is incredible and Senna is a master. Now Hamilton gets a lot of hate because he wins all the time. Schumacher did as well, and I think Vettel definitely did get a lot of hate when he was winning all the time. I actually used to work with someone who absolutely hated Sebastian Vettel because he won all the time. It's not fair. It's not his fault. He's doing what he's paid to do, to win. And he does it very well. A little too well, I guess, is the problem, but you can't blame him for that. But as a fan, it is kind of disheartening to know you're going to be watching Formula 1 throughout 2020, a whole year's worth, and it's going to be the same as this year, where Hamilton is just going to run away with it. Because the regulations aren't changing, the drivers aren't changing, the field is actually pretty much the same, apart from a couple of instances. What do we have to look forward to? I can see Hamilton dominating again next year if you want my prediction. He'll win it again by America or Mexico. And, it's not fun to watch, so that does breed hate, unfortunately. And, I think another thing he brings up is that Schumacher had the number 2 driver. Again, as I said, Bottas is pretty much a number 2 driver. That's not a big point about Schumacher, because Schumacher was still very, very good. Deserved champion, and in 94-95 he didn't have a number 2 driver technically, although again his teammates weren't great. Was it Johnny Herbert and Jos Verstappen? Was Martin Brundle one year? I can't remember. 94 he won by the skin of his teeth, and you can argue, did he cheat against Hill when he smashed into him? I was 4 at the time, and it's my earliest, probably my earliest memory overall, but definitely my earliest memory of motorsport is watching that 94 Adelaide Grand Prix with my parents, who were big Formula 1 fans back then. When Schumacher and Hill collided, my earliest memory is my dad saying some very strong words that a 4-year-old should not hear against Schumacher, whether he deserves them or not. So yeah, that's my racing experience. That's probably when I started watching Formula 1. I was probably 4. I mean, I technically probably watched it earlier because my parents always watched it. So my earliest memory is 1994. Exciting stuff. That was like a very exciting time in Formula 1, I thought, back then. So I grew up with people like Hill and Schumacher. Like I watched every race of the Schumacher era. It wasn't always very exciting, I will admit. Now, one of the last points that ALDAS brings up is he hates people mentioning that Mercedes, like Hamilton's success is because Mercedes are so dominant. The problem is it's a pertinent fact. There has never been a manufacturer who has been as dominant as Mercedes. You know, and we go, this is the weakest era of Formula 1. There hasn't, only Mercedes, Red Bull and Ferrari have won races since 2013. The first race of 2013, which was won by Raikkonen in a Lotus. No one else, no other manufacturer has won a race since then. Most of those races have been won by Mercedes. Ferrari have won a few, Red Bull have won a few. Not loads. Mercedes have dominated to a degree no one has before. And that has allowed Hamilton to rack up these massive stats where he has almost the most wins, the most poles, most laps, fastest laps. That is a pertinent fact. You can't get away from it. And as much as you hate people mentioning it, you know, the fact is true the other way around. People do bring up the stats when they mention Hamilton, so it can't be helped. Mercedes are the best manufacturer on the grid by far. That makes it easy. And my problem with Hamilton is it's always been too easy. He has never been challenged. You can say what you want about Rosberg. Hamilton outright was better than Rosberg. And that means you just never have, with Ferrari and Red Bull, you never have a fair fight because they're not on the same level. People have been going on all year about Ferrari having the advantage because they can get 10 kilometers an hour faster down the straight. But what they've sacrificed to get that 10 kilometers an hour over a race distance, let's say, it doesn't work out in their favour. And it's kind of a development black hole because they can't get any more speed out of that car. But now they've taken downforce off it and meddled with it, and that car probably handles like dog shit. I think Vettel and Leclerc have done very well to be where they are when you consider that what that Ferrari must drive like. And Red Bull, great car, great chassis, but Honda, sorry, I'm losing my voice. Honda do not have the power of Mercedes. So Mercedes all round have by far the best car, the complete package. It's worked, like Ferrari and Red Bull have won races here and there. It usually involves something happening, something strategical happening, anything that takes the Mercedes out of it rather than beating Mercedes, because they can't. That's been the struggle. That's why these new regulations are coming in and they're so radical, because they need to end Mercedes' dominance for the sake of the sport. Because it's so boring watching Mercedes win all the time, and they pretty much do. Bottas wouldn't win races if this car wasn't so good. I can honestly say that. And Hamilton still would. But on a fair playing field, you've never seen Hamilton versus Vettel. You haven't. Because Ferrari have never been in Mercedes League, not the last 6 years. Red Bull weren't when Vettel was there. When Vettel was champion and Red Bull were dominant, it was the same. Hamilton couldn't compete on a fair playing field. So you've never seen these drivers head to head. That is why people bring it up. Hamilton, as great a driver as he is, has been boosted by a very good car. This is why I don't come on camera very often. I do lose my voice quite easily. Hamilton, in any other era of Formula 1, would not have these numbers. But Mercedes have absolutely wiped the field, and next year will be their 7th year. If it carries on, no manufacturer has had 7 years of absolute dominance. Ferrari managed 5. Schumacher racked up some pretty amazing numbers in that time. Red Bull had 4. Vettel racked up some pretty amazing numbers in that time. It's a problem with the sport as it is, and the regulations hopefully in 2021 even the field. That might only last a few years if it happens at all. Because I'm sure Mercedes and Ferrari will find ways around a budget cap. They have people paid to do that. I think one of the last points he mentions is Lewis Hamilton leaving McLaren to join a project at Mercedes, leaving a winning car. By 2012 you could tell McLaren were fucked. That they were going downhill. I would also mention Button beat Hamilton one year. Hamilton's early years, I think, are very dodgy in terms of the greatest driver of all time, because he had issues. Said 2007, 2008 he was incredible. Fine. You can have that one. 2009, the first time he's driving a car that's substandard. The start of that year, the McLaren was bad. It was a midfield car. McLaren, rather than like get his head down and try to do better than the car allowed him to exceed expectations, Hamilton was driving in like 12th and constantly moaning on the radio about, we got to do something, we got to sort this car out. That's not good for your team. He was young, I'll give him that. But throughout 2011, 2012, you saw pretty average performances in a pretty average car, and that's the problem. If Hamilton had a worse car, would he be as successful as he is? He has a very good car, he does very well in it. It's hard to say best driver of all time under those circumstances. So, there is no right answer, which I think ALDAS said as well. It's your views. Do you think he's the greatest of all time? I'd love to hear your comments, please. Leave them down below somewhere, wherever it is. Leave a like or a dislike if you agree. That'd be the easiest way to tell, honestly. And most of all, like I've said, I don't have a problem with ALDAS. I am a subscriber to his. When I started these videos, I didn't know about him. And he was one who, well, I guess because I was looking at a lot of motorsport stuff. ALDAS came up with my suggestions and I subscribed and I watched his videos every now and again. He's very good. I like him a lot. I disagree with the Hamilton thing on principle. And the reason I started this channel was to talk about motorsport. I'm a big motorsport fan, but I have no one to talk about it to at home. Like, my parents don't watch it anymore and my girlfriend hates motorsport. But as I said, I'm a YouTuber with 11 subscribers. Thank you for your support, by the way. ALDAS isn't going to care what I think. Hamilton's not going to care what I think. I would love to hear your opinions though. So leave them. I'll look at them. I'll answer back. I'll talk to you. I don't mind. I've got nothing to do. You know, I'm struggling with editing stuff because I have very bad editing software. It's a free one. I don't have money to put into this to get better editing software. And I feel I'm getting better at making videos generally. I've only been doing it 4 months or so. And over time I will get better. I would love to hit 20 subscribers by Christmas. So if you did like this video, subscribe. I do lots of motorsport stuff. I'm trying to get a Formula E livery video out by Thursday, maybe Friday. If you want to see that, subscribe. I don't really have any more to say, I'm just rambling now, so have a good one.